Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. To old companions in terror and darkness, I greet you again as old friends. To those who are hearing my voice for the first time, I must impart a warning, directed to those of a delicate or sensitive nature. Tonight's broadcast will not be a kind one. What you are about to hear are tales woven from the most nightmarish of thought, tales both thrilling and evil. Should your morbid curiosity get the better of you, I welcome you to stay with us and remove yourself from the world you believe. But know that you have been warned. My name is August Reach, and we will now begin. Thank you for joining me once again. Time seems to be moving more swiftly these days with... Oh. I'm sorry, my dear, I did not notice you. It has been some time since your last visit, has it not? I know, you cannot help it. I wish there was more I could do for you, my dear. I truly do. With all my heart. I must return to my readings. I understand, and I am well and truly sorry. Please forgive the interruption. My wife Mary decided to show herself for a moment, but she is gone now. I suspect I will not see her for some time after this. Let us fantasize for a moment that you are bargaining with someone over something of great importance. You are asking for a price that they are not willing to pay, but you are insistent until they offer up terms of the contract that would seem almost impossible to fulfill. It is a fair price, but it is a time before written contracts and binding law, so you use an alternative method of keeping your promises. You use a Bloodcoin, in a ritual that involves both parties slicing a cut on their palms and shaking hands with the arcane coin between you. Many used Bloodcoins to solidify deals in the past, as the penalty for breaking a Bloodcoin bond is harsh indeed. Our first story is titled Sacrifice. As I awoke among the gloom, the first sense to assail me was the feeling of dampness on the ground. I pushed against the floor to return to my feet, feeling a viscous liquid that clung to my hands. The second was the putrid odor that permeated my nostrils, and once consciously noticed made me retch violently until I had grown accustomed to it. The light in the chamber emanated from a single dim lamp upon a nearby wall some distance away, which I shuffled towards and sat underneath. Under the light of the lamp I could see the blood clinging to my hands, the apparent viscosity showing it was not a trick of my mind to its color. I took note of the lack of anything else to produce the abhorrent stench which decaying blood would not explain, but light barely penetrated more than 5 feet from its source in all directions, and I had moved 15 to reach the wall. This chamber was clearly quite large, and no doubt some hidden exit was located along its walls, in case one of my captors might have fallen in. I knew my friends would likely question my calmness if I ever escaped this place, but truthfully I am fearful. But I have never been one for feeling strong emotions. I suppose with the drawback of showing little excitement and feelings of joy comes the benefit of not spiraling into blind mania when confronted with such a situation. I took a moment to gather myself still. I recalled walking from my local pub to Tom's house on the outskirts of town to celebrate an announcement he had to make. I decided I could save time by cutting through the alley that connected Howler Street to Chester Avenue, rather than follow the main road around. Once in the alley, I found an elderly woman stopping me to complain she had thrown out a joint when I was assailed from behind with a damp cloth. And that was it. It was now I realized I was in some pain. My back felt bruised, and I had a dull throbbing emanating from my temple. I heard footsteps above me, which then moved to approximately where I was located before I saw light from the ceiling. The roof of the chamber was approximately 15 feet high also, and I instinctively bolted from under the light into a region of darkness to my right, that would allow me to observe unseen. Once the cover had been removed, an elderly gentleman with a deep scowl leaned into the chamber with a flashlight in hand and shone it directly down to where I lay a moment ago. Once he realized I was not there, he quickly scanned it around the chamber until the light nearly blinded my adjusted vision when it landed on me, making me cover my eyes in reflex. "Oh, there you are, friend." He broke into a smile and spoke in a very cheerful, mocking nature of a thick Cornish dialect. Last I was conscious, I was in the southeast. How long had I been unconscious? Or had they moved here for the purpose of anonymous kidnapping? "I see that little fall didn't bust your head too bad. Don't worry, it won't matter much soon either way." At this I heard more footsteps approach the man. I could hear a similar dialect from a woman upstairs next to him, but couldn't make out her words. "No, no, my love. He seems fine to me, perhaps a little shaken." Another murmur from who I presumed was the elderly woman asking me for help earlier. "Oh, Christ's sake, woman, what do you want food for? You ain't gonna need it." At this I seemingly came to my senses and felt imminent hostile intent. Scrambling to my feet, I moved forward. "What the hell do you want with me? People are gonna be looking for me, you know." "Oh, come on now, lad. Official police searches only go underway after 24 hours, and you've only been gone 2. If they do start looking for you, they ain't going to suspect me and Mary here. They never do. Never do." I looked again at the blood on my hands and realized it was all still fresh, and to form a puddle where I landed meant there must have been some others thrown in here a short while ago. "I will find a way out of here, and when I do, I doubt you and her will put up much of a fight." The old man began hysterically laughing before moving to close the hatch. "Boy, we ain't the ones you gotta worry about." And then the hatch closed, and I was returned to darkness. It felt far more oppressive with the threat looming over me, and all evidence pointed to other people having been thrown in here before me. Perhaps they were fearful and hiding in the darkness, so I began to search. I moved forward until I reached a wall and kept a hand to it, making my way slowly around the perimeter. I reached one corner and felt nothing on the ground or against the walls as I moved, but there was no blood on the floor here. I was now tracing the wall on the far side of the room in total darkness, with the dim wall light 30 feet away on the opposite side. I moved my hand up and down over the wall rhythmically as I moved forward, making sure to move at a snail's pace so to be sure I wasn't missing anything. My hand eventually found something about 4 feet up, something metal, bolted into the wall. I felt around it carefully before discovering a metal ring was attached to the bolting joint. I traced my fingers along this metal ring before discovering a metal chain. Here I had a reasonable idea of what I was dealing with, but pressed on nonetheless. I felt along the chain, which moved diagonally downwards until my fingers brushed over a hand. I stepped back reflexively, still unable to see anything, but knowing whoever was there was bolted to the wall, with likely another chain anchoring their other hand. The hand felt warm, but I heard no breathing other than my own in the deafening silence. "Hello? Can you hear me?" I heard shuffling and moved further back, but maintained my composure that this was another victim, and on the off chance they were not, they were still restrained. "Were you captured and thrown in here like I was? If you're too weak to speak, just make a noise, something, anything. I want to help." The sound of a woman sobbing drifted through the darkness, so feeble that I knew she was close to death. I would likely not be able to save her, but this woman was no threat to me or anyone else. I moved forward again. Maybe I would be able to unbind her at least so she could lay down properly for the time she had left. I found the chains and traced them back to the metallic bolted rings and began to pull with all my might. Despite my best efforts, nothing came of it, and the poor woman continued to weep softly, never once struggling or saying anything. Maybe she was so far gone she didn't even hear me, and thought I was the old man coming down to commit what horrific acts they had already done to her. I felt immensely guilty abandoning her to the wall, but I knew that she would likely be far better off if I escaped and brought the police back with me. I continued my search for some sort of hidden mechanism to reach the outside. It would likely have some airflow from the other side if I were lucky, so I traced my fingers even slower than before, but kept them at 2 feet from the ground. I completely finished inspecting the wall that the poor woman was bound to, and once I met a corner thoroughly inspected the full length of the joint. It had been difficult to find obvious gaps due to the harsh brickwork and going off of nothing but touch, but I was still confident there was nothing there. Before I could continue my search, I heard the woman let out a small grunt of pain and begin heavily breathing, but then returned to normal. I couldn't help it like this, I needed to escape. The second wall proved fruitless as well, and once I had reached the wall with the light source again, I came upon an idea. The light on the wall was most definitely not there for myself or any other captors. It must have a secondary purpose. I moved under the light and began inspecting it, grateful for being able to actually see what I was touching. It didn't take me long before I located a seam that was concealed within the grooves of the brickwork, something that would have only been done to conceal this door from the outside. It was worse than I realized then, as it meant this chamber must have been custom built for this exact purpose. I was in some kind of dungeon, but for other than the purely speculative reason of perverse pleasure, couldn't work out why someone would go to all this trouble. I tried in vain to get some purchase, but the seam was incredibly narrow, and I couldn't find a good grip. I went to take my keys from my pocket, but realized they were empty. This insane couple were careful to consider all options. At this, though, I heard the woman begin to cry out in anguish. I stumbled back into the dark inside and rushed to her side. Please, talk to me. I can help you if you tell me what's wrong. But there was no response. Just loud screams between heavy, rhythmic breathing. Then a thought occurred to me. One I prayed was incorrect. In the darkness, I felt from her arm down the side of her body and moved it to the front to confirm my suspicions were horrifyingly true. A large stomach on an otherwise nimble frame. She was pregnant and about to give birth. My mind flared with anger. So many possibilities of how this came to pass coursed through me, and all left me feeling hollow and sickened. I didn't know what to do. I had zero experience in childbirth and no medical training at all, not to mention I still could not free her from the shackles. Another cry of pain left her lips between her wails and crying, and I had never felt such a combination of pity and uselessness. She could be in labour for hours still. If I could get help soon, it might save both of them from this nightmare. I had to get that damned hatch open, somehow. I rushed back over to the hatch and began wildly kicking it with all my strength, hoping to get it to cave even slightly that I might pry it loose. As I started kicking, the footsteps from above moved rapidly to the centre of the chamber, and the cover was lifted once again. "What the bloody hell is all that noise?" The old man shouted as the hatch was lifted away to let the light pour in again, along with watching me kick the hatch. "Well, I'll be damned. You exit. Go on, lad. Give it some welly. You might actually break it in about half a year if you put your back into it." I ignored his taunting and kept hammering away at the hidden door, hoping it was just a poor attempt at reverse psychology. The woman let out another pained cry from the darkness. "Oh shit, it's happening again!" At this, the old man replaced the cover far quicker than before, and I redoubled my efforts to kick the door clean out. I continued for another 5 minutes before the woman let out a sudden pained groan once again. But the way the sound morphed into a horrific, unworldly growl stopped me dead in its tracks. Suddenly, silence filled the space. I was truly scared now, but still not sure of what. I heard movement and dripping before the sound of a distinctive shuffling that was coming closer through the darkness. I stayed near the light, realizing I was in full view of whatever was now moving through the emptiness, but dared not step into it either. For what was the first time in my life, my heart pounded in my chest. This was not natural. Whatever these insane people had done was a violation towards nature. A moving, living baby should cry. Why was it not crying? The next 5 minutes were pure agony. Whatever approached moved at a snail's pace and occasionally took breaths to wheeze as it ran out of air often. I had all but given up on the door. But perhaps once I knew what this thing was, I could overpower it or kill it, giving me more time to get this damn hatch open. When it finally came close enough to make out its shape, my wildest imagination could not prepare me. On the ground was what looked like a young infant, but disgustingly mutilated. The lower jaw was missing, along with an entire arm, and its left leg had the flesh from it reduced to some writhing mass of small ligament and tiny muscles that gradually pushed it along the floor, which, coupled with the various body parts of the mother repurposed into disgusting limbs, kept it moving towards me. This thing resembled some sort of crippled, disfigured spider crafted from leftover sinew and bone. I bolted to my feet to run back to the other side of the room, but from the darkness another mass of flesh shot towards me at tremendous speed, striking my arm. The moment it did, the flesh of the creature seemingly molded into mine, and I fell onto the floor screaming. I clawed and kicked and screamed as several animate pieces of viscera slid under my clothes and melded with my skin, and soon the sounds of my tortured cries for help died on my lips as all my strength left me, and I felt my body being broken down into whatever use these horrifying entities had for it. My mind began to slip away from me, but I was dark, cold, hurt, need, friend, find, friends. The penalty for breaking a Bloodcoin oath comes in several distinct parts. Firstly, the offending party is overcome with feelings of dread and paranoia. This may onset gradually or be felt suddenly and violently, with some weaker souls even taking their own lives before the next phase begins. The second phase, if the person has the will to endure the previous episode, are visions of shadowed phantoms, always just out of view or within crowds not clearly discernible. This will last for several weeks, before the final phase, where the offending party vanishes without a trace, aside from the smell of sulfur that is present around their last known location. Bloodcoins, however, carry an even greater threat, one people who enter them seldom realize. The next story is titled Strands. The town of Birdwest would appear to many of visitors half asleep, almost forgotten to the outside world. It is situated next to a sprawling lake in Scotland surrounded by hills and unfavorable terrain, and the only thing that separates the town from the lake is a singular long road that, despite being many years old and in need of repair, is used daily by commuters coming to and from the city of Badgerton to other neighbouring towns or cities. The lake was almost 3 miles long, with the town on one side and more sprawling hills on the other. Birdwest itself was over 2 miles long and no more than half a mile in width even at its centre. The people of Birdwest often travelled into Badgerton for their own employ as well, Birdwest's town centre holding very few work opportunities in these modern times. Originally a mining town, Birdwest had been an important part of the local economy, delivering much-needed coal to itself and the nearby towns. The residents were fiercely proud of this duty they bestowed upon themselves, so much so that when the mines were no longer sustainable, due to any number of causes depending on who you speak to, the town sunk rapidly into financial and mental hardships. Birdwest held very few sources of employment and, for a time, so much so that for every person who fed their family, 4 other families went hungry. The town underwent a time of great change. Many saw their legacy in the mines and so chased that ending dream to other towns and places with still active mining positions. The younger generation saw the chance for change and growth, so educated themselves and their elders into other work outside of Birdwest, but never leaving their town behind. Through this fractured identity, the town's spirit dwindled and the community slowly scattered, leaving a town with more strangers than friends. One such business that weathered this storm was the Howler Hotel, one of the few buildings in Birdwest located closer to the lake than the connecting road was. The city was only a half-hour ride away, and the combination of view, competent management, and cheaper pricing made it an attractive prospect to visitors. The Howler only gained in business after the closure of the mine, but otherwise remained small and humble in its service to its guests and the fellow townsfolk. The residents of the Howler were the first to notice, on a Thursday morning, the Strands coming from the lake. Overnight, several ethereal threads had emerged from a spot in the lake halfway between either side's banks, and were slowly growing towards the town. They seemed to vanish from certain angles and shone like crystal strings when viewed from others. Each one gently flowed through the air as it traveled, but not in time with any earthly wind or force. By the time word had spread through the town, and it had spread fast as word does in small towns, the strands had reached the lakeside. They flowed gently in time with an imaginary breeze, and a man overcome with curiosity reached out to grab it. Others watched as his hand simply passed through it, like a phantom that did not belong in our world. He reached for it again and again, trying to grab any number of the now dozens of long strands that were moving towards the town, but he found no purchase. The crowd of people were now calmer, but light murmuring had broken the tense silence, and others stepped forward to try to interact with the strands. Each was met with failure, until one young girl tried to grab a string, only for it to move swiftly through the skin of her hand and seemingly attach itself to her heart. She tried to move away, but it moved with her now as if bound, and when she attempted to swat it away, her hand passed through its glittering presence again and again. She began to scream and cry, drawing a crowd. Her mother and father both failed in their attempts to grab the strand, begging for anyone to get it away from their little girl. They had assumed her cries were in some pain or mental anguish from the latching, but when other strands bonded to people in the crowd, the strands had seemingly no effect. The girl quickly calmed down once the strands harmlessly bound to her parents as well, and though others were now fearful and hesitant, they seemed to have no adverse side effects aside from causing unrest. More and more strands grew from that central lake point, and soon all residents of the town had a ghost-like strand connected to their hearts. The town had a new mystery, and many of its residents started to seek answers. The first to give them were the religious. Birdwest had a small but active church community. The local vicar, Father Joshua, was a known man who was trustworthy and worldly, having helped many through difficult times in their lives. He calmed his flock by offering the explanation that morning that these strands were God's blessing, a divine marking to show the truth and the purity of the soul, and that Birdwest was chosen for its divinity. Many rejected this answer. Birdwest had its fair share of sinners, and even the devout did not enjoy entertaining the notion their life lived in service to God was on equal grounds with known adulterers and thieves. Many were fearful of the strands. They believed them to be an omen of death and coming darkness. A team of locals took a boat and went out to where the strands broke through the surface of the murky water. They had intended to don diving equipment and investigate the cause of these strands, which they believed lie at the bottom of the lake, as the strands had not moved. Once they arrived at the location where thousands of strands breached the surface, all members of the diving party felt the need to return to shore. Even the most senior diver, who had experienced in almost every environment around the world, said that she felt the most primal desire to get to safety, as if millions of years of evolution had culminated in that one instinct not to approach the source of the strands. For many, this only engorged the flames of fear, giving rise to mass hysteria until key community members could calm them. Many fled from their homes, and once outside of Birdwest, the strands would seemingly snap off with no consequence. Upon this realization, many fled their homes never to return, but others felt this unnecessary. The strands had done no harm, barely done anything at all, even despite following people about their daily lives. After several days, government officials began investigating these claims. The strands, however, were not visible to those outside of Birdwest, despite constant pleas to visitors coming into the town from scared locals. The claims were put down to a case of mass hysteria, and official investigations were put underway into leaking gas lines and drinking water quality to try and find rational explanations. After the initial wave of curiosity and fear had subsided, the strands had still not shown any indication of a purpose outside of existing. The town was split into two main factions: the silent majority, who grew tired of discussing and fearing the strands, who lived with a constant unease but acceptance of this new reality. The other, vocal minority, insistent on discovering the cause and purpose of the strands in order to quell their own fears and dread that some hideous purpose might be in waiting. Life returned to normal, outside of new strands attaching to any newcomers who moved in, but the town quickly developed a system for informing newcomers of the possibilities. Many rejected it as psychosis and left the town as quickly as they arrived. Others felt like they were suddenly a part of something grander, a community, a group of people who all shared a common purpose that they now belonged to. The town's new identity was beginning to form around these strands, and soon the vocal minority learned to keep to themselves, but were never dissuaded from searching for answers, as the townsfolk still had a strong undercurrent of curiosity. One morning, around a year later, Father Joshua passed away. He was the first person to pass since the Strands, and once he passed surrounded by family members, word spread very quickly, for his strand was returning to the lake, with his seemingly sleeping ethereal form attached to it. Hysteria gripped the town in a landslide. The strand took a straight line from the church to the lakeside, which passed through multiple buildings and open spaces, giving multiple people time to observe the sight. The vicar's spectre floated gently through the town, taking almost a full hour to reach the lakeside, by which time almost the entire town was in attendance, either on the viewing deck of the Howler Hotel or by the lakeside itself. The townsfolk were in universal agreement. This was the soul of the vicar being taken by the strand, but to where was met with responses ranging from heaven to damnation. Once Father Joshua's visage had reached the lakeside, the strand stopped moving, and his form awoke. No indication of joy or sadness, nothing discernible at all upon his face. He stopped floating and stood upright by the lake's surface, before beginning to walk on the water of the lake towards the resting point. A group of people quickly jumped into boats and went out with him to the center of the lake. The townsfolk watched from a distance as the vicar's form made its way slowly onto the body of water, before stopping at the culmination of the strands. And just as suddenly, he was gone. The residents of the lakeside were left still without answers, save for the numerous boats now headed back to shore. Once they returned to dry land, they were swamped with questions. Many of them were shaking and deathly pale, stopping only to tell their loved ones to pack their things immediately. They were leaving the town. One older woman, Mary Tinner, was on the local council and called for an emergency town meeting for all who wanted to know what happened. Half an hour later, the local hall was filled with the entire town's residents, many standing at the walls or poking their heads through the crowded entryway. As Mary began to speak, the whole town fell silent. Once Father Joshua's form had reached the culmination of the strands, he was seen to stare down at them, seemingly past them, below the surface of the lake. She described how as he stared, his face twisted into one of revulsion and dread, as if his gaze could now pierce the murkiness of the water to view what was underneath. He wordlessly screamed and tried to tug at his strand, but as he did, the strand went taut and pulled him down through the water with incredible speed. Screams and panic fell onto the crowd before Mark Bennett, the latest of his mining lineage, stood aside the trembling councilwoman and bellowed loud enough to draw most of the attendants' attention. Some say he gave a rousing speech that day. Others say he demanded action, with threats of violence or blackmail. But through his words he assembled a makeshift party to finally investigate the waters before the town was abandoned forever. One boat left the dock, carrying 5 people. The town waited for 2 hours, holding its breath, when all of a sudden the strands all simultaneously fell apart into shining dust. By the time the town had rushed to the lakeside to investigate, the party had returned. 3 people, and an entity beyond all notions of what is natural or acceptable to our reality. A man and woman had been killed in the apprehension of the entity, which resembled an enormous clam with multiple sprawling tentacles coming off of it, likely acting as anchors into the lakebed. The rows of teeth on display were flimsy and jelly-like, but stung lightly to the touch. The inside of its mouth was filled with rows upon rows of small holes, each roughly the diameter of a strand, and it had multiple puncture marks from the fishing gear used to kill it. The sight of the entity began to induce powerful headaches in those who viewed it, and so it was covered and hidden away. The 3 survivors, one of which was Mark, did not return with any bodies, nor did they talk about what was necessary to kill the entity. They all seemed drained of life, barely responding to either the praise or insults different townsfolk bestowed upon them. Once darkness descended, the townsfolk rejoiced and began to celebrate, though the 3 members of the hunting party were not in attendance. They were all pronounced deceased the next morning. Rumours abound it was the entity taking a curse, but Mark had left a note that only the town physician, Dr. Willow, read, before promptly throwing it into a fire. He quickly informed the town the deaths were suicides to curb panic, and the sanctity of death was their reward for the price they all had to pay. Yet he never told another soul what that price was. The corpse of the entity was deemed too important to bury, and no one dared burn it. Some believed it to be a now powerful talisman that may ward away further evil, and so it was decided that the corpse would be kept locked away in the basement of the town council chambers. Even after many years, no sign of decay was ever seen in the corpse. The lives of Birdwest again returned to normalcy, and within time many had even begun to forget the Strands and the strange entity that spawned them. Many theories arose about the entity, perhaps a divine servant sent to judge the wicked and found the vicar wanting, perhaps a freak occurrence of nature and no more unnatural than the fish in the lake. Many held in their hearts, however, that the death of the entity was a good thing, and silently prayed their town would not be host to such mysterious forces again. A Bloodcoin pact is firstly unbreakable. Once entered, both parties must fully fulfill their part of the agreement, or one or even both parties will suffer a terrible fate, regardless of circumstance. The second is this: the ritual does not need to be performed to enact a Bloodcoin's malice, and any precious item or coin could have the magic woven into it, giving it the title of a Bloodcoin. Be careful who you do bargains with, for even the change in your pocket may carry a promise you cannot keep. Our final story is titled Castle Dahlenbach. March 17th, 1852. My name is William Potter, and if you have come across this journal among the interior of Castle Dallenbach, then stop reading and leave immediately. If you are still within the walls by nightfall, your fate is sealed, like mine inevitably was. I write this letter knowing I have very little time before the living dead come for me, and I pray you take this message seriously for your own sake. I have not used this journal for many months, but now I feel compelled to leave one final entry detailing my findings and to spread awareness of this place to others before I perish. I will endeavor to hide it before they reach me, but there is much to chronicle among these pages that will lend credibility to them beyond a wild tale of fancy. I am an unmarried bachelor, 27 years old, and was born and raised in Kensington. My mother is of no particular note, but my father was an associate professor of history at Oxford University, with a specialty in early modern Europe, particularly a keen interest in Germanic history. As I later discovered was rather unconventional, he would often conduct field research himself, taking month-long excursions to travel into Central Europe, hunting down leads for ancient texts or a newly discovered dig site. Approximately 3 months ago, I received a letter from my mother that my father had been gone for nearly 5 weeks, a length of time unheard of even for one of his trips. I made arrangements to go and comfort my mother, and decided shortly after that I would trace his footsteps and try to locate him. My father was a more than capable man who could talk his way through most encounters, so I trusted he was alive, but perhaps in some troubling situation. When I inquired if father had told her anything about the trip, she said he was evasive and aloof about it for some weeks before he departed, kept repeating something about a breakthrough and that his name would soon be enshrined in glory when he brought his findings back with him. Father would often get excited, but he had never been one to chase glory or recognition for its own sake, so this must have been an incredibly rare discovery. The next day I began my inquiries at the university, asking colleagues if they had heard him mention of any details or lodgings of a travel destination. Rather unsurprisingly, they had heard little, and gave the air of being all too important to care. I admit father gave off this air often in my youth, but my father has been gone for weeks. Was there no camaraderie between these men? One associate, however, a Dr. Karl Fresher, had spoke of my father often on their lunches, and remembered a single detail. Castle Dahlenbach, located in the north of Bavaria. He informed me that it held no real interest to the historical field. It had a similar history of being constructed in the early 10th century within a secluded mountainous region, used as both a position of military strength and for nobility to reside in. No other notable events had ever been chronicled there as far as Karl knew. It was, however, more than enough for myself, and I thanked him greatly for his time and knowledge, and returned home to inform Mother of my findings. She was incredibly pleased that I had found some information, but still urged me not to pursue, lest I find myself in the same sour fate my father might have been dealt. I comforted her, and assured her I would return home with father in tow. I am sorry I lied to you, Mother. Please do not read on if you are. It will only deepen your sorrow. I made the necessary transportation arrangements and calculated it would take me approximately 1 week to reach a nearby town where I could begin my search. It was the most likely place that father would have begun his journey, so I held out hope that maybe he was safe and stranded there, unable to make arrangements home for whatever reason. I was not so fortunate. Once I arrived, I checked into a central hotel with my passable German-speaking ability. Upon mentioning my father's name, however, and Castle Dallenbach, I felt like my questioning was being brushed aside. The man began to visibly sweat and seemed extremely anxious. So I pressed my inquiry further, but was met with a firm resistance, and what I believe was a harsh, firm direction to not investigate the castle. It was late, and I could continue my search tomorrow, but I seldom slept. The man had clearly seen my father. Likely he stayed in this very hotel, as there were few others this central. It was his visible fear that kept me awake. Perhaps there was some group of lowlives who had claimed it and the town was scared, but such a protected building would surely be kept, looked after by authorities due to its cultural significance. Perhaps it was superstition of some kind, like a haunting or a curse. Such tales were commonplace for buildings of grand size and history, but I soon felt sleep take me and would have to find out more tomorrow. I awoke early and began asking other sources likely to have seen my father in town. Many people seemed to have not heard of my father, but when I mentioned the castle, they grew fearful and reluctant to continue the conversation like the hotel clerk, and I began to grow fearful myself. It was not a superstitious fear that filled their eyes. They all reacted as if it was natural to be fearful, so something beyond rumor had definitely occurred there. I was warned many times not to venture there by concerned townsfolk, but all signs pointed to my father leaving for the castle and not returning. I had asked many carriage drivers throughout the day about my father, and not one recognized the photo, until early evening, when one immediately grew tense on seeing my father's picture. He informed me he had been the one to transport my father to the castle, and when he returned the next day at the agreed time to transport him back to town, he did not come out, and so returned here. I asked him to take me to the castle, upon which he very calmly and succinctly told me my father was dead, and tried to leave. I flew into a rage, and began berating the man for telling me such things when he had seen no proof, and demanded to know why everyone was so fearful of the castle. I must have shouted quite loud, for my words caused a deathly silence in the people around me. I turned to all of them. "Well? Come on, why are you all so fearful of that damned castle?" The crowd quickly dispersed and hurried away, and when I turned back, the carriage driver was already down the road. I could not have felt more isolated and useless. I felt that the only option was to head to the castle and discover its secrets for myself, and perhaps the carriage driver would take me if I did not antagonize him further. I reassigned myself to my room at the hotel, and fell quickly into sleep from mental exhaustion. I woke up in the middle of the night with a start. My window had swung open, and I stared at the open gap with my adrenaline racing. I turned my head to the door just as a figure lunged towards me and pinned me to the bed. I screamed out and struck him several times, but my heavy blows had seemingly no effect, and his hand had an impossible vice-like grip on my throat. I truly thought I was about to die, before he seemed to hiss like some demonic creature, and I could have sworn he jumped upwards and gripped impossibly to the ceiling, before scurrying away out the open window like some startled insect. I immediately got up and bolted the window closed, seeing that in my exhaustion I had forgotten to close the hatch. I was in shock. I could have swore it was a man who had broken in, but the leap and crawling along the ceiling haunted me as I lied in bed. I stayed awake until dawn, fully alert, at which point I felt decidedly more relaxed and made my way downstairs. I was in shock, so only just realized I should inform the hotel clerk, but when I told him what happened, he only seemed to care that I was safe and okay. I was still shaken and didn't question his calmness about the situation, so hardened my nerves and made preparations for the travel to the castle. I tracked down the carriage driver first thing to ensure that he would not take another customer, and through a promise of extra compensation for the journey, he agreed to take me to Castle Dahlenbach as he did my father, under the condition I ask no questions. I reluctantly agreed and we headed off around 9. The trip was indeed silent. The road out of town seemed to steadily ascend the landscape until we began taking more mountainous paths, with large cliffs on one side and a steep drop into dense woodland to the other. The path could easily take the width for the carriage, but I began to feel increasingly nervous, like I was perched on the edge of some cliff and a gust of wind would throw me over. Once the castle was finally in view, the cliffside to my left had fallen away, and we were now headed up to the top of the mountain where the castle resided. Castle Dallenbach itself was beautiful, an estate that easily covered 10 acres of land with a grand steepled tower in each of its 5 corners, with no clear sign of decay. It must have been maintained incredibly well, for it seemed almost recently built in its conditions and splendor. As I took in the awe of the castle, I began to feel a dread descend upon me, and realized the deafening silence had now worsened. There was no wind, no bird song, just the monotonous sound of horse hooves and carriage wheels on the well-worn road. It felt unnatural, and with that through came the images of the previous night's assailant, hung from the ceiling and hissing violently. I could not give in to fear. My father must be here and may yet require my help. The carriage driver took me to the main gate and stopped, to which I stepped out. "Tomorrow, just after dawn, I will expect you." He nodded with what seemed like a deep sadness and took his leave. 5 minutes later, I could no longer hear the carriage and was left alone with only my breathing as noise. I approached the door and found it unlocked, to which I entered cautiously. The foyer was huge and did not reflect the outside at all. All the curtains were drawn and a thick layer of dust lied upon the many furnishings each room had, with some being covered in a white cloth completely. The atmosphere was dank and oppressive beyond what any abandoned building should have, and so I lit a nearby candle and began my search hesitantly. In total, it took me 5 hours to search the entire castle, never once encountering another soul or finding any hint of my father. Some areas were without dust entirely, and there was a singular room where I found traces of a recent fire in the fireplace, so perhaps my father had been here for some time. It was just before dusk that I heard a loud crash coming from the southeast rear of the castle. I was towards the northern areas, so to hear it I knew it could not have been some consequence of the wind, but an intentional, loud noise. I hurriedly made my way through the castle, twisting my way between long corridors and narrow staircases, until I reached a long, intricately decorated hallway I had gone through not 2 hours earlier. I saw someone, at the end of the corridor, quickly move out of view, and my anger flared. Was this the man who attacked me? Who had my father? I leapt into action and began to chase them, shouting while I ran. "You there! Stop! Where is my father?" I was not in full control of my mental faculties, but nonetheless felt emboldened. I followed the only path at lightning speed, but stopped short halfway round the third corner. A section of the wall had been slid away, and in front of me was a staircase descending downwards into total darkness. The air grew cold in front of me, and my heart pounded in my chest, and I realized the chase was a trap. My answers lie down those old, cut-out stone stairs, but so did a sense of impending doom I struggled with, and I wasn't sure if the price was worth the cost. After taking several heavy breaths, I made my descent. The candle flickered in the breeze coming from below, and the light barely went past the 4th step. The stair started to curl, reducing my vision of what lay further down even more, and I could feel my throat tighten. I reached the bottom into some kind of catacomb with stone arches making square arrangements in 20-foot distances, allowing for a large chamber with periodic pillars in continuous rows. Scattered about were empty coffins, which terrified me beyond belief. What horrific things was this madman doing? I saw a faint light no more than 50 feet ahead of me, and moved quickly to investigate. A corpse was sat on its side with the face away from me, and my heart sank. I ran over to it, but my hand hesitated as I went to touch it. The corpse wore clothes my father would had the same build, the same hair. But if I didn't see the face, then I could never be certain it was him. Maybe that's what I wanted. To live in some hope he'd return someday. I cried as my hand moved closer and closer, and I eventually turned it over, the image of my father's pain-stricken expression in death, forever scarred into my psyche, and 2 small wounds upon his throat. My tears turned into hysterical wailing, which further devolved into primal screams of pain. All of this for nothing. Just as my crying ended, I screamed into the darkness. "Show yourself, coward! Fight me like a man!" The candle flickered again with the presence of a strong wind before extinguishing completely. I removed a match quickly and relit it. But as I struck the match, dozens of twinkling lights reflected back at me from the emptiness. Dozens of red, blinking lights. My heart froze in my chest and fresh tears wept again. I could fight one man. I stood no chance of escape against over 30 at a count. At this acceptance, I heard my father's voice whisper into my ear as he gripped the back of my neck. "My friends and I need to feed, lad. Please do not let us down." I swallowed and now knew I had stumbled willingly into hell. "What evil has taken you, father?" "No evil, son. Just power and life everlasting. Now stay still. I grow thirsty." Father ripped the right side of my shirt to gain access to my neck, but then jumped away and began to hiss, as did the other eyes around me in the darkness. It was here I realized they must have an adverse reaction to the crucifix necklace I wore, and it was what had saved me last night and right now. I now had a means of defense, and so I held it in front of me as a protective barrier and began to move through the catacombs back to the stone staircase. The creatures seemed to follow me in a tight circle, and when one approached I swirled and thrust across at them, forcing them backwards into the darkness, hissing and cursing. I saw all manner of faces, some young, some old, men and women, even a child or 2. I made it back to the stairs and moved backwards up the stairs, keeping the crucifix at arm's length the entire time, being careful not to slip or lose my balance. I could hear them as I moved, always just round the corner of the staircase. Occasionally one would dart into view, then retreat just as quickly. Once I reached the top of the staircase, I was back in the corridor, and had no way of closing off the hatch without leaving myself vulnerable for a brief moment, one I'm sure the monsters would act on. I made a decisive choice. I placed the candle on the floor in front of me and stood my crucifix against it, acting as a barrier in front of the door so long as they could see it. Then I ran. The noises and taunts I heard as I ran were bone-chilling, but adrenaline carried me at speeds I did not think possible back to the main foyer. I did not know if there was another entrance to the catacombs than the one I had blocked off, but prayed there was not, and once in the main foyer I was moments from being outside and able to escape this maddening place. I slammed into the main door and grabbed the handle, revealing it to be locked. I cursed and screamed and kicked and slammed the door with all my might, but it would not open. I could not hear the creatures, so assumed the cross was doing its job, but that would not hold them forever. I ran to a nearby window, but they were all set with heavy iron bars beyond the glass, something I had not noticed on my journey to the castle. There was no escape. I eventually slumped to the floor and began to cry fresh tears, both from grief and fear. I decided this fate would never happen to another living soul, and so took out this journal and began to write. I was drawn to the bookcase in this side of the room when I first arrived, and perhaps you might be too, so I will hide the journal there in the hopes you discover it, and those things do not destroy it. Never let anyone you know come to Castle Dahlenbach. If you have the power, burn it to the ground. Nothing of value will be lost. Goodbye, mother and father. I love you with all my heart. Blood coins are an answer to a problem that seldom requires use these days. Most of the time, a written contract and the threat of punishment from government or authority is enough to keep us true to our word. But even now, there are those among us who use blood coins to punish or attack cheaters without their knowledge of the forces acting against them. I pray you stay true to your word. The broadcast has now concluded. You may extinguish your fires. Good night.